this morning just with a little quick review. Our passage today is, I don't know, it's not short, but it's not long either. And so I wanted to kind of do just a little quick review to kind of get everybody up to speed with where we are. But, you know, if you'll remember last week, Naomi and Ruth have both come back to Bethlehem from the land of Moab. And Ruth begins to make herself busy quickly, and she goes out to glean in the fields to provide. It is the barley harvest, and you know, if you know anything about wheat harvest or barley harvest or corn harvest or any harvest for that matter, they say, you know, you got to make hay while the sun's shining, and that's true because it doesn't wait for you. And I can remember whenever I was a kid, you know, my dad would have my mom bring meals to him in the field, because if that combine was stopped and it wasn't moving, you know, he wasn't making money in his mind, and there was always that danger that, you know, that a storm could come along and ruin that. And so, but anyway, she goes out to gather and glean in the fields, and this practice of gleaning is God's provision for the poor and needy to obtain food. And not only was it incumbent upon the poor and the needy to go out and do the gleaning, but it was incumbent upon the landowners and those that owned the field to give them the opportunity. And this is found in the law. This principle of gleaning is found in the law. It's taught in Leviticus 19, and it began with, you know, as we talked about last week in our class, Moses was instructing God was instructing Moses, I guess I should say, to speak unto the children of Israel and to say unto them, ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And then he goes on in chapter 19 to show them what holiness looks like. And it's not just about simply obeying commands, but it majored strongly on how to deal with one another, how to deal with strangers, how to deal with towards their brother, towards their neighbor, and certainly to the poor and even the stranger. And so each instance of God's instruction to the children of Israel was followed by the phrase, I am the Lord, there in chapter 19 of Leviticus, and that puts God's authority behind it. And so we saw that God's providence was evident in directing Ruth to the field of Boaz. And Boaz, we kind of learned a little bit about who Boaz was and a little bit about Ruth's character as well. First of all, we knew she was hardworking and she was diligent, but Boaz was a God-fearing man, and he treated his servants well. When he goes to the field to check on their progress and to check on the affairs of the things that he was the steward of, he addresses his people and he says, the Lord be with you. And they answered him back and said, the Lord bless thee. That's a relationship there that shows forth that Boaz is a man who fears God. He invokes the name of God there, and he's a diligent man looking to well to his own affairs, and he takes note of Ruth out there in the field gleaning. He notices this stranger in his field, if you will. He had not seen her before, and he inquires of the chief servant of his as to who she is. And this man has a glowing testimony of Ruth as well. He says that she has come to him seeking permission, and that she has not ceased to stop working since she arrived. And so Boaz speaks with her and shows great grace to her. And so we looked at, you know, Boaz is the Christ figure of the book of Ruth. And the story of his story is that he goes beyond the letter of the law concerning how to treat those who glean, and he demonstrates great kindness to Ruth. And we kind of looked at 5 things, and I'm just going to recap those real quick, that Boaz displays in his conduct towards Ruth. First of all, he entreated her as family, calling her daughter. And we need to remember, first of all, that Ruth is a young woman who is going through a difficult time, and I guess if you could just put yourself in her place, it'd been a tough year for Ruth, and so he treats her as a daughter. He provides her security for her. He says, "Go not to glean in another field. You're welcome to stay here and glean in my field." And you know, it wasn't while the law provided that the landowner was to round the corners of his field and he wasn't to glean all the crop that fell to the ground, it didn't mean that everyone obeyed that. And so just to go to a person's field and glean had with it a certain risk of being asked to leave or being kicked out or being treated harshly. But he tells her to go not to another field, you're welcome to stay in mine. And he practically adopts her by saying to her, abide here fast by my maidens. And what he's communicating to her is that she's one of his. And he makes provision for her safety. Have not I charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And I said that Boaz instituted the first sexual harassment policy of the ancient world. He gave her protection, and the protection that he's communicating to her is that his servants are not going to expel her from the field, and they're not going to treat her harshly. But then probably the most significant thing that Boaz does to her is he communicates to her that whenever she's thirsty, she's welcome to go to the vessels and drink. And we talked about that the culture of this time was that the women drew water for the men, and strangers drew water for Israelites. And yet Boaz welcomes Ruth to drink of the Israelite water. And by that, he's simply communicating, you're not a foreigner, you're an Israelite. And that must have been a comforting thing to a person who was a stranger in the land of Israel to be treated like that. The grace of Boaz solidifies him as the Christ figure of the book of Ruth. And lastly, we talked about how Ruth showed gratitude towards Boaz because of the grace that he extended to her. And she said to him, "Thou hast comforted me." Boaz didn't just provide sustenance to her, he ministered to her emotionally broken condition, a hurting stranger in a foreign land. And she further states, "Thou hast spoken friendly unto thine handmaid." Boaz, as the Christ figure, didn't administer grace in a cold and mandatory manner after the law, but he did it with kindness. And this is the way God deals with his children as well, isn't it? God deals with us that way. He doesn't just meet our needs out of a duty and obligation, but he does it with kindness. And we'll see today what kindness means. And kindness specifically means love and action. Let's go ahead and read in verse 14 of Ruth chapter 2 where we'll start. It says, "And Boaz said unto her, At mealtime come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. So she gleaned in the field until even, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up, and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today? And where wroughtest thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, The man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. And Ruth the Moabitess said, He said unto me also, Thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have ended all my harvest. And Naomi said unto Ruth her daughter-in-law, It is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens, that they meet thee not in another field. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. So we see here the Boaz's actions exemplify an abounding of grace towards Ruth. He's not content to just tolerate her, allowing her to glean in fulfillment of the law. Boaz was a man who knew the law, and he certainly lived his life apparently according to that. But he graciously grants her absolute permission to glean in his fields. And he treats her with kindness in so doing, and he welcomes her alongside his maidens. He allowed her to drink of the servant's water, and at mealtime, he welcomed her to sit at the table. And he tells her to dip her morsel in the vinegar, and Boaz serves her personally. When you get to dip your chip in the family queso, you know that you're family. All right, and she gets to dip her morsel in the vinegar, and he even serves her with his own hand. It says he reached her parched corn. He serves her himself, and that's great grace. That's grace that goes beyond the law. So there's really no place for legalism in the faith of a covenant people of God. Just simply a cold adherence to the law, to the letter of the law, is really outside of the intended purpose of the law. In the covenant of grace, the law's purpose was to safeguard and to enrich the relationship of love through the exercise of obedience to God's commands. Jesus said, if you recall what Christ said in John chapter 14, he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And the purpose of being obedient to the law was to keep that relationship with Christ, is to keep that relationship with Christ right, isn't it? And that's what the purpose of the law is. Certainly we know that the law is a schoolmaster to bring us to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. It reveals what sin is. It tells us what sin is. But the law goes further than that, and it preserves that relationship with Christ as we obey His commandments. These verses tell us a story not of sufficiency through strict adherence to the law, but of generosity, which gave Ruth more than she needed. Boaz told his servants to permit her to glean among the sheaves and not to rebuke her. That's not something that he typically would tell his servants to do. He's basically saying be wasteful. He says leave some handfuls on purpose for her to pick up. And I'm sure his servants, looked at him, and maybe they knew of his character, and they thought, we understand what you're saying and we get it. And they probably did. If this was 2024, he would just say, take her to the back of the truck and open the end gate up and just let her fill her sack, right? I mean, that's the generosity he was showing to Ruth, and that's sort of the mindset of Boaz. And so we should understand that in the Jews' religion, the law was never intended to be an external code just requiring strict adherence. That's not what it was for. In the context of the covenant relationship, the law represented the principles for God's people in a relationship in a relationship with God and in a relationship with one another. It wasn't really until the law was separated from the covenant that the children of Israel began to practice this thing of legalism, right? And so when that became the overriding concern and strict adherence to the law became the thing, that's when the Pharisees began to, that's the Pharisaical attitude, I guess, that you see that Christ deals with there in Matthew. And he quotes, and Christ quotes to the Pharisees there. He says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. That's Deuteronomy 6:5. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The law was to be understood as the application and practice in particular situations of the primary command of love. What was the primary command that God gave? To love the Lord thy God supremely, right? That was the primary command. And he said the second was like to it to love thy neighbor as thyself. And he said on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And so the primary thing here that God's teaching is love for God and love for neighbor. What we see in Boaz's actions is a gracious generosity that goes beyond the letter of the law, doesn't it? And concerning this gleaning, this practice of gleaning, and it demonstrates a concern for the law, which is, of course, for the purpose for which the law was given. And that concern in this instance is that the law of God expressed of care and provision for the poor. And so we talked a little bit about that last week. That was that was part of the law, was that God provided for the poor and the needy and for the stranger, and He made a way for them. We talk about today's welfare to some degree, and we'll run down the welfare system in America, and certainly our welfare system has a lot of problems, doesn't it? But the laws of our land ought to some degree be parallel to the laws of God if we are truly a nation that's under God, right? And that's the biblical principle for our laws. It ought to provide for the poor and the needy. And so we ought not to be this kind of people that say, well, just nothing for anyone. Just let people, just make it on their own, and however, just let them work it out themselves. That ought not to be our attitude as Christians today and citizens of this country, certainly. And so the application, we can be the kind of people that live our life according to the law, right? And according to the commandments, and just this very strict adherence to it. God gave the commandment, the great commandment, which was what? Go ye into all the world, right? That's the commandment. Teach the God to communicate the gospel to people. We can live in a strict adherence to that and callously obey the Great Commission by giving to missions out of duty, right? Maybe out of our abundance. We can show up for visitation and be like robots, right? Going to the door, and hello, we're from Bible Baptist Church. We would like to invite you to our church. Here, read this. It tells you how to go to heaven. We've done what God said, right? We've done strict adherence to the commandment of God, but that's not very compelling, is it? If we're just doing it like that, this half-hearted attempt to share the gospel. We can show love for our neighbors by calling the fire department when their house is on fire, right? That would be, I guess, to some degree, a strict adherence to the law. Hey, I love you, so I'm going to call the fire department and let them know your house is on fire. Or we can be the kind of people that show great grace, right? That go beyond the letter of the law. We not only give sacrificially to missions out of love, but we spend time in prayer for our missionaries and also trying to encourage them as well. That would be above and beyond, wouldn't it? We show up for visitation having prayed that God would open the door and allow us to communicate the gospel to someone, maybe in someone whose heart He's been working in, and He would put us in the path of someone like that. Do we ever pray for that whenever we go out on visitation or when we try to witness to someone? God, put us in the path of someone tonight in whose heart You've been working. That's a different mentality, isn't it? We demonstrate love for our neighbors by not only sharing our faith, but also by looking for opportunities to be a blessing to them. It might look like going over to their house and pulling them out of the fire to some degree, right? But it certainly would look like something different than just being this callous, we'll love our neighbors as ourselves. Well, how would we ourselves want to be treated, right? And so this product of grace, let's look at verse 17 here. It says, so she gleaned in the field until evening and beat out that which she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. And so Ruth concludes her day having beaten out the threshed gleanings, and it amounts to an ephah. An ephah barley. Well, how much is an ephah barley? Well, if you go start looking to try to find the answer to that, it's not easy to find that answer. It's a tenth of a homer. And a homer is an omer or a homer. I think it's an omer. I say homer. It's an omer. It's a tenth of an omer. Roughly, it could be somewhere around 39 pounds is what it's sort of. Here comes Ruth. She's toting this Santa Claus sack up the hill. And her mother-in-law sees her, and she's expecting her probably to come back with maybe an apron full of barley that she's gleaned, but instead she's got this big bag of barley, and so. I can just only imagine, the sight of Ruth of doing that in Naomi's eyes whenever she sees it. It's a lot, and Naomi's overwhelmed. In verse 19 it says, and her mother-in-law said unto her, now I'm not good at reading the Bible with that what do they call that? Not emotional reading, but I can't think of the name of it. I'm trying to think. What is it? Expression or something like that. But she says, her mother-in-law said unto her, where hast thou gleaned today, and where wroughtest thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee. She's excited. She's got a big bag of barley. She's excited for not only for Ruth, but also for herself. And she prays a blessing on Ruth's benefactor. And Ruth tells her that the man's name is Boaz. Now, to Ruth, that means nothing. But to Naomi, that means something, doesn't it? And let's look and see what this says. In verse 20, it says, and Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, the man is nearer of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. So Naomi breaks out in praise to God, and we need to understand that the object of her praise is not Boaz. The object of her praise is God. Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And so let's just take a look, and I, if you will indulge me just a little bit of this word kindness. Let's look and see what this word kindness means. Now, I sometimes think that whenever we sort of begin to look and see like at Hebrew words or Greek words, people can kind of nerd out on that sort of thing. But there is something to this word kindness. The word that's translated as kindness is, and if I'm saying this right, chesed. All right, chesed is the name of the Hebrew word that is translated in kindness, and it's sort of a difficult word to translate into English, as people will say. Many biblical words such as mercy, compassion, love, grace, and faithfulness sort of relate to that word chesed. but none of these completely summarize the concept. Chesed is not merely an emotion or a feeling, but has the sense of love in action. And so it's used over 250 times in the Old Testament as an expression of an essential part of God's character, which is his unfailing and steadfast love. God promised to Israel in Isaiah 54:10, and he's speaking to the children of Israel, and he's saying, "For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord, that hath mercy on thee." You know, when God tries to communicate the permanence or the enduring of characteristic of his love for the nation of Israel, you know, he does, I guess, what we would think, trying to make his audience understand. He says, he talks about the mountains. For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed. If we think about a mountain today, we think that's something that's enduring, right? It's endured the test of time. It's there. It's permanent. It's not going to be the same. I can remember, you know, going to the mountains as a kid and then going back as an adult, even not too long ago, to some of the same places that I went as a kid, and they look the exact same. The rocks look the same. There's nothing that's changed. It's literally the same thing. But even though that may seem permanent to us and that may seem enduring, that's nothing compared to the love and the unfailing love that God has towards his people and his covenant people of Israel. And so the mountains and the hills are just a representation of something that God tries to help us understand, that even more so than that is his love towards Israel. And it also has the sense that at the heart of this faithfulness is an unfailing love, and that the understanding is that it's completely undeserved. Not just is it an unfailing love, but it's a love that's undeserved. And if you think about this, you know, there's probably, the word chesed is clearly seen, is no more clearly seen than by God's willingness to allow his love to continue and his mercy towards his people, even though they continually turn their heart to false gods. You know, and it wasn't like God is surprised whenever he made Israel his covenant people. He's not surprised that they turned their heart away. And God is omniscient. He knows all. And he knew that they would do this, yet he chose to put his love and place his love upon them. And not just a temporary love, but a permanent love, an enduring love, an eternal love. And you know, it's probably no more clearly illustrated than in the life of Hosea. God commands Hosea to go and take a wife of whoredoms. Now that's kind of what God did when he took the nation of Israel, didn't he? He knew that they would depart from him. He knew that they would turn their hearts to other gods. But he instructs Hosea to go and take a wife of whoredoms, and of course Gomer does what harlots do, and then he instructs Hosea in Hosea chapter 3 and verse 1. He says, "Then said the Lord unto me, Go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel." He instructed Hosea to go to her and love her in the same manner that he loved the children of Israel. You know, there's a parallel that exists there between Hosea's love for Gomer. Was unworthy, wasn't she? She was unworthy of the love of Hosea. And certainly the nation of Israel, his people, his covenant people, are unworthy of his love, yet God does love them. Hosea buys her out of slavery for 15 pieces of silver and a little bit of grain, and this unfailing love and this rich gift of grace towards Gomer who is a woman, as a woman who has no claim upon it. That is what this word that's translated kindness means. And so as Naomi says, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead," she's talking about that kind of a love. From Naomi's perspective, this new development is like a ray of hope. A woman who's had, nothing has gone right for Naomi from the time they left Bethlehem to the time that she's returned. Nothing has gone right. She's lost her husband. She's lost her 2 sons. She's a woman who's living a destitute life. Literally, she's been reduced to gleaning in the fields, right? And living with her daughter-in-law, who is a stranger, who is a Moabite. There's really nothing that's going her way. But she sees this as a ray of hope, and I guess in what you would say is in a dark valley. In no way does this absolve the pain of having lost her husband and her sons, yet this kindness shown to her by God is indisputable evidence that God is not that God is mindful of her. You know, sometimes that's kind of where God takes us, isn't it? God takes us to a place where all we can see is darkness and all we can see is no hope, but yet, you know, it just takes just the least little ray of light for us to sometimes say, you know, God still loves me. God still cares about me. And that's kind of where Naomi is. Naomi tells Ruth in reassurance to Ruth, she gives praise to God for his unfailing grace, love, and kindness to her. And Naomi tells Ruth of the relationship of Boaz to them both in what seems like, I think it seems like an effort to encourage her. And, you know, if you go back to the first part of the chapter, it says Ruth's hap was to land in the field of Boaz. Well, we know it wasn't fate. We know it wasn't a coincidence, or it wasn't just happenstance. It was God's providence in the life of Ruth and God's providence in the life of Boaz that's working his will out, and we'll see that later on in the book here. And so this kinship is significant because it represents the providence of God in this situation. Boaz is not just some generous benefactor. He's a blood relative, and as such, Boaz has the potential to become to fulfill that kinsman role. And so Naomi sees the gracious hand of God acting through the gracious actions of Boaz. You know, God often uses human instruments as the conduit for his kindness to his people, doesn't he? You know, if you think about it, you know, God can show kindness through all kinds of means. But isn't it a privilege when God uses his people to do that? To be an instrument of God, to be a vessel of God, that's something that I think all of us should desire. There's countless examples in the Old Testament. Think about Joseph. Joseph was an instrument of God's grace to his brothers. You know, and he says to them, "Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it for good." And then Joseph goes on to say to them, Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. The grace of God is evident in the life of Joseph, and he acts the part of the grace of God. It shows you the grace of God is at work in his life. There's examples in the New Testament as well. I'll just give you one. Paul cites the testimony of the churches in Macedonia, commending them for their sacrificial giving. I want you to turn over real quick. Hold your place here. Well, actually, I think we're done there. Go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, if you will. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. This is the Apostle Paul, and he's speaking to the Corinthian church, but he is offering to them the example of the churches of Macedonia. And he says there in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. And this is, and he says, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of ministering to the saints. Though they themselves were in deep poverty, you know, Paul didn't have to ask them to give. No, they prayed that he would receive the gift that they desired to give. And how did they do it? Well, verse 1 tells us. It says, Moreover, we do you to wit of the grace of God. It is the grace of God in the lives of the people of the churches of Macedonia that enabled them to do what in their power they could not do, but through God's power and through the grace of God they could do. And so I believe it's the same grace of God that is bestowed upon Boaz. He is the Christ figure, again, in the story of Ruth. And so, you know, what is sort of the application that we can take from this today? Because I believe that in this passage, there's an application that we can make to our own lives today in the day and hour in which we live. You know, we choose each day to be either the kind of vessel through which God's grace can be demonstrated to others, or we choose to limit God's ability to show forth of his grace through us, don't we? And we have that power to be able to do that. We have that power to either be a vessel fit for God's use or to be unwilling to be used by God. You know, is it that we don't see, you know, a world full of broken people? You know, does this world need the grace of God shown to it? Certainly it does, doesn't it? Like never before. And all around us, every day, wherever we go, is a world that needs the grace of God. People that need to see God manifest in a person that is Christ-like, one of his people that can show forth his grace to a broken people. There's ample opportunities, but you know what? It's not just people outside the walls of this church; it's people inside the walls of this church as well, isn't it? Sometimes I kind of wonder. Sometimes we focus all of our efforts on ministering to people that are sometimes even outside the walls of our church, ministering to people that we know in the community or whatever the case may be, people at work or family or friends. But you know what? There are people who are discouraged right here in our congregation today. I have no doubt that there are people that are sitting out there today that are discouraged. I have no doubt that there's people sitting out here today that are lonely. And those are things that we can show the grace of God, right? People who struggle with finding purpose in their lives. I can look forward to, I'm not going to look forward to a day, but I can see ahead a day when, if the Lord allows me to live long enough, there may be a time where I wonder, God, why am I here? What purpose do I serve? Whenever you're young and you're raising a family and all those different things, you can clearly understand God has a purpose for your life. But sometimes we need to think about this. Whenever a person gets to be in their twilight years and their senior years, that sometimes I'm sure they look around and go, their body's hurting, they're aching. Maybe they can't even do the things they want physically in the aspect of service to God, and they begin to wonder, well, God, what good am I? Of what use am I to you? But, we can encourage people like that. We ought to look for people like that and opportunities to be an encouragement to them. And some have experienced great loss, the loss of a child to the world. I know there's people in our church who've experienced that. And I can't imagine the hurt that is. I personally can't. It's got to be painful to be a believer and to see a child go to the world, and that's a hurting people, isn't it? The loss of a spouse, either to death or maybe even divorce, and those are situations where people are hurting and they need encouragement. They need to see the grace of God, and people that right in our own church. I'm not trying to tug on heartstrings this morning. I'm just trying to say we need to open our eyes and try to be like Boaz, to be an instrument of God's grace. It's not something that we have to have great riches. Boaz had fields, he had wealth, and certainly he could be a minister of the grace of God. But we can be a minister of God and be poor as a church mouse, can't we? Because many times all it takes is a kind word to minister grace to people, and that's free. He was a man who feared God and who looked diligently to the affairs of life. He took note of a widow woman from a strange land, taking intentional actions to minister to her the grace of God. And to Ruth, that looked like this. It looked like security, safety, comfort, and belonging, didn't it? And to Naomi, it was hope, and for the hopeless to that extent. And so, I think as Boaz is the Christ figure, we ought to desire to be Christ-like as well, and that he is an example to us as children of God of how we ought to conduct our lives. We ought to look well to the affairs of our life in the sense of be diligently seeking those opportunities. Be diligently, sometimes we can kind of get. I even notice it among myself. As we before church begins and things like that. Sometimes we can kind of get off in our little group of people that we like to talk to, and just sort of be honed in on that 2 or 3 people, right? But yet there's people that need someone to minister to them, aren't there? There's visitors that come that need someone to come up and encourage them and thank them for coming. These are opportunities to minister the grace of God to people right here in the church, and to get our eyes off of ourselves, get our eyes off of those that are in our group, and get our eyes upon a wider array of people, and to be that kind of vessel that God can use. And so I would just encourage you take the example of Boaz, and I think we can apply that to our own lives and see what God will do with it. All right, you're all dismissed. I appreciate your time.